Throughout history, motorcycle companies have found themselves often in an all too familiar position, basically needing to update to stay relevant, and sometimes not just stay relevant, sometimes it's do or die for these companies. At no point in history were so many companies tested in this way like the end of the 1960s. In just a few years, the dominant British companies went from their absolute peak to a rapid death, primarily due to the motorcycles coming out of the East. With the onset of the Honda CB750, a new benchmark had been set. It wasn't about just making bigger, more powerful motorcycles, although it was that. If you wanted to compete, you needed to have models that just did everything and were also relatively affordable. Everyone was trying to build the ultimate motorcycle at this time, a bike that was fast, easy to use, and reliable.
Now, before we get too far into this story, I want to give a huge shout out to Hemmings for sponsoring this video. Hemmings is an amazing family-owned jeweler that I got in contact with about getting a nice kind of retro mechanical watch, and they actually helped me land on this beautiful heritage-inspired Hamilton Intramatic Auto, a watch thoroughly inspired by 60s racing and style. And if you guys have watched my channel for a while, you know that this fits my vibe. Hemmings has this awesome, simple, easy to use e-commerce site where you can go and look not only at their fantastic selection of watches, but also jewelry as well. For watches, there's an amazing selection from Tag Heuer and Oris and Seiko, Hamilton, Tissot, and more. Their website also includes tons of educational content to help you make an informed purchase, and they have absolutely fantastic customer service. If you want, you can easily get in direct contact with a Hemmings in-store employee by simply using their live chat feature, and they can help you out. So on top of being able to ship a watch, for example, right to your door if you're in North America, you can also just get that personal touch and help you might need. Now with Hemmings, we've set up an exclusive deal for you guys. Hemmings has never done this. If you purchase anything on the site using code BART, B-A-R-T, you will get 5% off, but it's only available for the next 14 days, so get on it now. I'll make it easy by putting a link in the description below, as well as in a pinned comment. And again, big thanks to Hemmings, not only for sponsoring the video, but for helping me find this beautiful watch. All right, let's get back into it. BMW's motorcycle sales were trending down at this time. Many of the higher-ups within the company wanted them to just give up on motorcycles altogether. The R69S was the flagship motorcycle at the time, and it was a brand-building bike in and of itself in those early years, but with the Honda CB750 and the oncoming slew of other big, sophisticated motorcycles coming down the pipeline, well, these were sure to make BMW as obsolete as virtually every other non-Japanese company at this time. It's this next motorcycle, though, the R75/5, that would lay a foundation for BMW to build their ultimate touring machine. The R75/5 was a truly all-new motorcycle for the company with a new but thoroughly familiar power plant. All of the changes to the engine came from BMW's experience building car engines to give this motorcycle more power, less weight, and to be more efficient to build. A major part of BMW's problem at this stage was the fact that they couldn't build their motorcycles in mass, and the previous engine in the R69S cost about as much as a car engine to build. And if BMW was going to not only build competitive bikes with the likes of Honda and the other Japanese companies, they needed to be able to produce their bikes in mass for a somewhat reasonable price. The R75/5 was released in October of '69 and lasted through '73. It was a motorcycle with many of the necessary updates to keep BMW afloat and a legendary bike in its own right, especially for those of you interested in a classic BMW with that classic BMW style. The bike was sportier than its predecessor and better in almost every way, but it was still dated in comparison to the Japanese superbikes that came out during its 3-year run. It was not a class leader. I mean, it made 50 horsepower, while Honda and Kawasaki's big bikes were pushing 70 horsepower. It had a 4-speed gearbox, drum brakes, and it just didn't have the same level of innovation as its competitors, but it cost a significant premium, $2,225. That was expensive when you compare it with the $1,495 sticker price of the CB750. So BMW needed a world beater at this point if they were going to survive this era, and the R90S
would be that motorcycle. The BMW R90s came out of a desire from some at the company, despite pushback, to build the ultimate 900cc sporting boxer. The market was moving so fast at this point with the release of Kawasaki's 900cc Z1, even the CB750 was kind of starting to look dated. So BMW had to build something competitive with the fastest motorcycles in the market, and they had to build something special. In many ways, we have legendary automotive figure Bob Lutz to thank for the R90s. He was the executive vice president of sales for BMW at this time, and he saw the need clearly. Lutz was massively influential not just in the development of the R90s, but also in the restructuring of BMW's motorcycle division as a whole at this time. It wasn't just that sales were down for no reason. BMW was becoming more and more lackluster in their motorcycle division. Honestly, the entire motorcycle part of BMW was pretty much on its way out when Bob stepped in to help create the R90s and essentially to help save BMW motorcycles as a whole. See, the main problem with the previous /5 was that its design wasn't really a primary feature. The design and the function didn't go hand in hand. It didn't break out of the old styling, and BMW really needed a radical change in this regard if they were going to bring in new riders to the brand and also, hopefully steal a few Honda guys. But the current design for the company's motorcycles was essentially 50 years old at this time. So for the R90s, they brought in Hans A. Muth to head up the entire design. He started by looking at his own dream motorcycle that he had at that time, which was the MV Agusta 750S. And he quickly realized that there were quite a few similarities between BMW's current lineup and the MV Agusta, from the clean, simple engine design and really the simple lines all around. There was a flair to the MV, though, that BMW just did not have at this time, and had never had. BMW's simple and very elegant black bikes just weren't inspiring riders the way that they had previously, but this MV Agusta, this motorcycle was special and emotive. For Hans, flow was everything in designing the R90s, from the entirely new in-house swooping fairing, down through to the tank, all the way back to the tail section. The bike needed to have a simple, flowing design, and he really did nail this. And we learned this from looking at the Z1 as well. A consistent design language is really important for motorcycles. Early on, they decided to ditch the front rubber fork gaiters. They added new logos, and in the end, the bike was really a stark departure from any previous BMW design, but the public loved it. It had a touring but also sporting feel, and it was unique enough to be distinctive from pretty much everything else available. Now, when it comes to the engine, BMW is going to have to get creative, because taking the R75/5 motor and turning it into, a high revving fire breather like the Japanese were doing with their inline fours, that was just never going to happen. This Boxer twin was never going to rev to 9,000 RPM. So the focus was rather on all-around performance instead of just power. A new 5-speed gearbox that was lighter and smaller than the outgoing 4-speed, Italian racing carbs, the cylinders were bored out to 898 cc's, and it only weighed about 10 pounds more than the R75/5, which really is impressive. Despite the focus not being entirely on horsepower, the power was way up over the outgoing models, 67 horsepower at 7,000 RPM, and significantly more torque at way lower RPMs than, for example, the CB750. In the end, BMW had on their hands a motorcycle that, in stock form, may not be quite as fast as some of the big inline fours that were coming out of Japan, but because of that torque, these motorcycles would be, above all else, thoroughly enjoyable and fun and simple to ride. And that brings us to the chassis, which was again a sort of evolution of the previous /5 chassis with a focus on increased flexibility. Interestingly enough, again, this was a big touring-focused bike. The goal was for riders to take this bike anywhere and feel as though they can ride it in a fun, sporty way wherever they are. In many ways, one could point to the R90s as a sort of precursor to BMW's touring prowess going forward. All of the peripherals, though, kind of make up the whole, from that bikini fairing housing these purposeful white on black gauges to the new front disc brakes. All of it came together with this great, fun, characterful engine and chassis, and ultimately, the bike was reliable. And this would make it one of the best motorcycles of its day, many would argue the best. BMW's entire lineup was updated at this point, but it's the R90S that really was the pinnacle of BMW's engineering capability. It's here that they showed what they were capable of. Now, we can't talk about the R90S without mentioning the paint scheme. As unimportant as paint is to some riders, and also it seems to some manufacturers, the decisions made in terms of the paint for this bike are some of the most radical we've seen in motorcycle history, and it's a massive part of what made the R90S stand out. Since the dawn of the company, BMW motorcycles at this point had basically had the same paint scheme. With this bike though, BMW departed from the old ways with this striking silver, gray, and then black, almost ombre paint scheme. It looks almost custom. Hans Muth points out that the fade from black to silver as your eye moves down the motorcycle from back to front indicates a merge from tradition to the future, which history would show this bike absolutely did signify for BMW. But even the black isn't BMW's age-old glossy deep black, it's actually a little bit lighter. No doubt this is one of the boldest paint decisions we've seen from any major company, especially for a flagship model like this. This was really risky, but in the end, BMW had a thoroughly recognizable model that may not have spoken to everyone, but it really did compel many riders looking for a premium sporting machine. But the logistics of even seeing this paint scheme fully realized on a production model, especially at this time, but even more at BMW, a lot had to change for a bike that looked like this to come out of BMW. But I think this was a really good example of the higher-ups being convinced and being willing to trust the people who were designing and developing the machine. And that's so important. When a boardroom comes in and, shuts down a paint scheme like this, they don't realize that they don't actually know what they're doing, and that the people who have the vision and the passion are the ones that should have the freedom to make the kind of motorcycles that riders actually want and that riders find interesting. In 1974, the R90S cost about $3,400, somewhat more than the $2,950 price tag for the standard model, that is the R90/6, and quite a bit more than, say, a Kawasaki Z1. But finally, BMW had a model that at least somewhat justified that price tag at every point. I mean, they were never going to take down the Japanese companies, but those with a bit more change could get themselves a bike like the R90S that was as fast as anything out there, and it had impeccable quality and craftsmanship, and it was just a unique, cool, fun machine. In March of '74, Cycle got their hands on an R90S for testing, and in the end they concluded that it did cost quite a bit, but regardless, this was the best motorcycle that BMW had ever made. It could hang and often pull away from a Z1 at just about any speed, and it just didn't look like anything else that you could get. It's one of those bikes that the more you look at it, the more you get it and the more you like it. Even as I've made this video, I've come to like it more and more. Over time, the model grew and evolved, eventually getting double front disc brakes and mainly small updates to the transmission and engine based on complaints and, also updates to the chassis. But the main thing to know is that with this model, BMW managed to make one of the single most compelling sport bikes of the 1970s, arguably the most competitive decade in motorcycle history. This was one of the fastest motorcycles in its day. It's the motorcycle that Triumph and BSA and Norton should have made and needed to make, in my opinion, and probably could have. Sure, it's a bit more expensive than the Japanese offerings, but who cares? It's a true alternative, and if it's good, it's good. Some riders will choose it just to be different. And that was BMW at this time, and for whatever reason, companies like Triumph just couldn't make the massive shifts internally to build an incredible machine like the R90S. The legacy of this bike would live on in BMW's next models, including the 100S, but even today, BMW makes premium touring and sport touring and adventure motorcycles, and yes, they're pricey, but there's no denying that they lead in many of these classes, and that DNA links all the way back to this moment in time when the R90S was developed. All the major changes at this point in the early 70s that took BMW from really being a relatively antiquated motorcycle company to essentially being a world leader. And that transition showed not just on the production side, but also in terms of racing. Prior to the R90s, BMW was not really known for their racing. Sure, they had success early on as a company, but most of that had faded by the 70s. Okay, they were good at sidecar racing for some reason. The R75/5 had some success racing in Europe, but it's the R90s that would prove itself against the big boys at places like Daytona. At first, factory race versions of this bike were used in endurance racing, but the pinnacle of its racing success came in 1976 at the newly formed Superbike series. The version of the R90s prepared for this would go down as one of the most incredible BMW race bikes ever built, completely souped up, reaching over 100 horsepower by the end of its day, and the goal was to beat the Z1. No easy task at this point, as race versions of the Z1 could rev out significantly higher and made a ton of power. The model was gone over at every point and at every level, not just the engine, but also updates made to the chassis and suspension to improve handling for racing. 3 R90s debuted at the 1976 Daytona, and all the hard work paid off. This bike was on another level, and through the season, it would prove difficult at points, but Reg Pridmore would ultimately secure the first AMA Superbike title in 1976 aboard an R90s. The bike would finish 4th the next year and then tie for 2nd in 78. It's interesting to look at what innovation means for different eras throughout motorcycle history, from technical improvements like the introduction of gearboxes or suspension in the early years, or things like electric start or just reliability throughout the 60s. At this point in BMW's history though, and really every company, surviving meant that you had to do it all. You had to build complete motorcycles, and that was the standard that was set. When you look at an old Honda Inline 4 and also old BMW Airheads, I mean, they're essentially just as reliable and usable and almost as powerful as most motorcycles today. You could buy a Honda CB500 or CB550 or 750, have it looked over by a mechanic, and commute to work every day and have no problems. Sure, a superbike today will leave these bikes in their dust, but 70, 80 horsepower, that's plenty for the road even today. And surviving this time meant essentially making what is pretty much a modern motorcycle about 50 years ago. And that's what we see with these BMW Airheads through the 70s and the 80s. These bikes are dead reliable and just so good. For BMW, that meant improving production efficiency and quality, investing the time and money necessary to develop and design truly exceptional machines, but more than anything, a sort of boldness in vision. The companies that couldn't handle all of this ultimately died. It's that simple. And the R90s, along with the entire /6 line, and then also BMW's motorcycles going forward, this would be BMW's salvation at this point. Now, before we end, I cannot thank Ian Faloon enough for sending me a copy of his fantastic book on the BMW R90s. This video owes so much to his research. I'll have a link to Ian's website in the description below. He's a fantastic author who's written many books on iconic motorcycles from history. With that being said, don't conflate all of my opinions with his. If something sounds accurate, it's probably from Ian. But yeah, thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you in the next one. Ride safe.